So today I'm currently a retired prof at Dalhousie University, and most of the funding from this project has been very grateful um, for funding from Environment and Climate Change Canada through their Habitat Stewardship program and also through their Priority Place program, and from the province of Nova Scotia through their Priority Place and through Habitat Conservation Fund. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background about why we should be the fix of the program, the project that I've been working on to to try to test beneficial management practices for uh, forest bird species at risk. I'll give you an introduction to beneficial management practices and how we've come up with the draft BMPs for the species I'll be talking about today. Then I'll talk about how we selected our sites for our study and the field protocols that we use to collect data. And then I'll dive into some of the BMP applications that have been done so far on Crown lands through my project. About a BMP for a particular species. I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to the species and its ecology as is relevant to the BMPs. We'll look at what the BMPs are, and we'll look at the preliminary results of those field trials. At the end, I'll give my thoughts on how you might approach using BMPs for forest bird conservation on private working lands. So just over 4 years ago now, I'm sure you're all familiar with this large study that was published analyzing all data for North American birds, joint between Canada and the US. And what they found was that we have lost nearly 3 billion birds and 1 billion in forests alone since 1970, which was when standardized land bird monitoring started. And of note, 3 of the groups that have seen the biggest declines are boreal forest birds, aerial insectivores, which feed on flying insects, and migratory birds. And just almost 2 years ago now, this was a very interesting study that you're also probably familiar with, published by Matt Betts and colleagues, looking at forest degradation as a driver for bird population decline. So they found that habitat degradation has occurred through intensive forestry and leading to a younger landscape that is less diverse and structurally simpler. And they found that even though the amount of forest increased, habitat actually declined for most forest bird species. So this is a very species-centered approach. And they found that populations of each species closely tracked the amount of habitat that was available. And you can see some of those species in the graph to the left. But it was the loss of habitat for a particular species that explained the declines. And of all the birds, the species of mature forests were the ones that lost the most habitat and had the steepest population declines. So this provides even more urgency to try to do something for our forest birds. So these are the 6 species that I'll be talking about today. They are all insectivores, which means they feed on insects. We have 2 aerial insectivores. We have the common nighthawk and the chimney swift. We have 2 sallying flycatchers. These are birds that fly out from a perch to capture a flying insect and then return to a perch to eat it, whereas the aerial insectivores are true aerial insectivores are catching prey as they fly and eating it as they fly. Um, our two salliers are the eastern wood pewee and the olive-sided flycatcher. And then Canada warblers can be considered aerial insectivores because they do capture flying insects and spiders, but they're doing that within the foliage, uh, basically the shrub layer of a forest. And the rusty blackbird is a little different in that it is picking out insects from shallow water and wet ground. But they're all dependent on insects and invertebrates, other invertebrates. If you look at the geographic ranges of these species, there's only one that is sort of a short distance migrant, a temperate migrant, the rusty blackbird up at the top. Um, the maps show the breeding areas in orange, their areas that they migrate through in yellow, the non-breeding areas in blue, and a few birds have a year-round area that is shown in violet, but mostly these what I want you to look at is the breeding ground and the wintering ground. So for these 5 species that are neotropical migrants, they're all flying primarily to South America for the winter. That means when you see one of these birds in the forest, they have flown at least 12,000 kilometers. They have to do that before they breed because if they hatch, say they hatched last summer, soon they will be coming back, and that will be at least a 12,000 kilometer journey to go down south and return. And studies have shown that birds that have to migrate farther are also in greater decline. And of course, they're subject to a lot of pressure on their wintering grounds, a lot of pressure for, there's a lot of habitat loss and degradation there. This table shows the conservation status of the 6 species nationally. So the COSEWIC is a group that recommends what the conservation status of a species should be. If that is put into law, then they are listed under the Species at Risk Act. And then each province will have their own species at risk list. And it's interesting to see that there are quite a few differences between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So for example, Canada warbler is endangered in Nova Scotia, but threatened in New Brunswick. Same thing for the chimney swift. And olive-sided flycatcher is threatened in Nova Scotia, but endangered in New Brunswick. So the rationale behind my project is that, we want to recover these species at risk bird species, and recovery depends on access to quality breeding habitat. But the breeding populations of our focal star are dispersed across working forest landscapes in Nova Scotia. There's just no way that you could put enough land into a protected area to recover these species. So we need to work on conservation of their breeding habitat within the working forest landscape. So the overarching goal of the project is to work together with the forest industry, with government, with NGOs, to find solutions that will benefit both the birds and forestry. And the specific main objective of the project is to develop and test in a collaborative and iterative process a set of operational guidelines for beneficial management practices for 5 land bird species at risk in Nova Scotia. And I'll explain why I'm talking about 6 species later. And we can see over on the right side an olive-sided flycatcher who's perched on a snag in a coniferous swamp open wetland complex. So what are beneficial management practices? These are voluntary practices that are aimed at reducing the risk and avoiding harm to a target while you are carrying out activities that can impact the target or its habitat. So, for example, the target may be a species at risk, or it might be mature forest birds. It could be turtles. It could be anything. But in the context of forestry, BMPs can help landowners and forestry operators integrate the maintenance or creation of key habitat features for successful breeding of a species at risk or other forest birds into forest management planning and forestry operations. Um, you may be familiar with some of the resources that have been developed for Maine through Maine Audubon and their partners. The Forestry for Maine Birds, a guidebook for foresters managing woodlots with birds in mind. And these are just four examples of BMPs, sort of general BMPs that are geared to, uh, you know, generating a forest landscape that is um, more suitable to a variety of species, especially species of conservation concern in Maine. So, for example, promoting structural diversity um, by including more softwood in a hardwood stand, or you know, retaining and recruiting snags, um, encouraging vertical and horizontal structural diversity. In that way, um, you're stewarding a forest that has space for more species to occupy. One of the most basic BMPs is to avoid harvesting during the nesting season. And Environment and Climate Change Canada has developed, in cooperation with Birds Canada, nesting calendars to consult when you're planning activities. So I've just pulled these out for the six species of interest here. And this would apply to most of the habitat in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So rusty blackbird starts nesting in early May and is finished by middle of July. But most of the other species are starting to nest in late May or early June, and kind of depends on the species how long their nesting season goes for. And the nesting calendars, the idea of not harvesting during the breeding season is a mechanism for trying to work with the Canada's Migratory Bird Convention Act, which provides legal protection of birds, their nests, eggs, and nestlings from destruction, whether you mean to or not. And this applies to virtually every native species, whether they're migratory or resident. Um, so, but rather than searching for nests, um, Environment and Climate Change Canada recommends either just not harvesting, or if you really need to know what birds are in a site, to go out there and do a singing bird survey, because you're very unlikely to find a nest and you have a high risk of disturbing it. Even if you don't find it, you could step on it. Um, the exception is for birds that build cavity nests, or that build or nest in cavities, woodpeckers, ducks, nuthatches, or birds that build large platform nests that are easy to see, like herons or hawks. So in 2021, Katie McLean at CARP was working on a series of SAR field guides for forestry and agriculture. And so I helped Katie put together um, the BMP guides for the 5 bird species that I was interested in working on. These were based on literature review with local knowledge added. And in spring of 2021, they were approved for release to the public and for use as a working draft for this project by our Department of Natural Resources and ECCC. If you're interested in getting copies of these, you can download them from our website. And I'm happy to, give Kate a copy to put on her website as well. So briefly, these are two-page fact sheets. They have an introduction about, how to identify the species, what's the habitat, what's their typical habitat like, what are the threats, and then on the second page is a section on how you can help. And basically, these are the BMPs. And so in this project, we started with that as a draft and then um, looked at, okay, given a particular harvest block, the situation of that harvest block, the species we're working with, what do you think we could actually incorporate into the management plan? Um, so to start this project, we were provided maps of harvest blocks from our forestry partners. We overlaid them with known SAR occurrences, with existing SAR habitat models, with wetlands and wet areas mapping and the forest resource inventory data. And we also used Google Earth to look at satellite images. So we targeted the most promising blocks, uh, um, which typically had wet forest or were forest near wetlands, to do bird surveys. We I'll show you a map in a second, sort of the scope of the project. We provided the results to the forestry partners, and then they looked at that and they sent back a list of sites where that they agreed to incorporate BMPs. So this is just a map of showing our ARUs, our autonomous recording unit locations for 2021. But it's generally the areas that we also surveyed with field surveys. And from those, it whittled down to, from about 120, it was whittled down to 14 sites to use for this, for actually applying the BMPs. Um, and so in 2022, we focused our work on those 14 sites, mapping locations of individuals, using playback to delineate their territory boundaries. And we also used ARUs to pick up additional SAR activity. When we got to a site, if we did not find species at risk spontaneously in suitable habitat, we used 30 seconds of conspecific playback of songs and calls to increase their detection rates. We had documented or verified that this did increase detection rates in a previous study. We determined the SAR locations by basically you're standing at one place and beginning over here, so your GPS location, adjusting for the distance and direction to the bird to figure out exactly uh, within about 10 meters of where the bird actually is. And we deployed ARUs to detect, to get additional information about SAR that we may have missed when we were at the field site. And we also monitored control sites where there was no harvest planned, where we already knew SAR were breeding, sort of as to use to compare for as a control, comparing to the harvested sites. And over on the right side is a picture of one of the ARUs. This is the little one called the audio moth. We also used larger ones called song meter minis. And we found that ARUs are quite useful for detecting SAR. This is just a quick analysis of our comparing whether we found the bird in the field versus in ARUs at the same spot in 2022. And you can see that it sort of differs between species. Birds we detected in the field surveys are shown in blue, and birds detected only in ARUs are shown in orange. And so you can see that for common nighthawk, for example, we detected many more birds in the ARUs than in the field. And that makes sense because they are mostly active at dawn and dusk, and we're only at dawn and dusk, only rarely out there at dawn and dusk. Olive-sided flycatcher, about half and half, and rusty blackbird, a little bit little bit more often detected in ARUs than in the field. But Canada warbler and eastern wood pewee we were more likely to, if a bird was there, we were more likely to find it if we went into the field compared to the other species. So I definitely recommend using ARUs. Okay, so how did we operationalize the BMPs? So those draft BMPs were intended as guide, planning, harvesting, knowledge about SAR habitat without necessarily having to verify that the SAR was present. But so they're basically ways to maintain or promote habitat for a particular SAR. But in our project, I thought it was important to uh, for a strong test of the BMPs to do this at sites with known SAR, so that we could ask the question, do the BMPs retain the habitat elements needed to support a specific SAR? And the operational protocols, basically you know, what the harvesters are actually doing in the field, were developed in collaboration with forestry partners and the province and the provincial biologists. And then these were incorporated into revised harvest plans. All of these sites had approved harvest plans to start with, and so they had to be modified to incorporate the BMPs, which was additional work and took additional time. And to document whether the BMPs are effective, we are resurveying the harvest blocks where the BMPs were applied. We're asking the question, are the SAR birds that we documented in the previous summer before harvesting, are they still present? Are they using the same area after harvesting? If so, then that's evidence that the BMPs work to retain the habitat elements that SAR needed. We are also obtaining drone images of the sites to document the habitat before and after harvesting. And this was actually, this is a drone image of the first site that was harvested, and sort of in the middle there was a olive-sided flycatcher, and the wet area, and that area was buffered prior to harvesting. Okay, so we're going to now focus in on particular species and the BMPs for them. First, we'll look at Canada warbler. This is a bird that likes mixed wood swamps. In Nova Scotia, we find it in semi-open tree canopy, in areas with a semi-open tree canopy, and as the bird needs emergent trees for territorial display. There's always a tall shrub layer, 2 to 5 meters high, where you have a high density of shrub stems, lots of dense foliage under 2 meters, especially cinnamon fern, and a very, very complex and messy forest floor. That's kind of even more so than what you can see in the lower right picture. They have a high site fidelity, and their territory size is about a hectare. They nest right on the ground, uh, on little hummocks, well concealed, surrounded by dense shrubs. Very hard to find the nests, and they may place them on or under woody debris, hummocks, and overturned tree roots. This is one of our sites in Cape Breton. The white is the area is the harvest block area. The little yellow diamonds are Canada warbler locations from 2022, and you can kind of make out some wetlands here. And if you plot the wetland layer, you can see that yes, these are open wetlands. And if you plot the depth to water table data, you can see that there is more wet area that's not really visible otherwise in the area. And so you can see that the Canada warblers are primarily using this area between the upland forest and the more open wetlands. So at this site, we applied BMPs during harvesting. And so I'll explain the general procedure here. So around every location that we documented a bird, and those are the little yellow diamonds, and the numbers refer to what we thought were different individuals. Um, we put a 25-meter no harvest buffer. And around that, so wherever 25 meters around every bird that we saw got a no harvest buffer. And these were multiple. You can see that we have multiple locations for the same bird because we're trying to map out their territories by using playback to see how far they would go. They're going to basically go to the edge of their territory. And then in the bigger blue circles, which extend from 25 to 100 meters from the bird's location, is our BMP buffer. And so in that area, using the draft BMPs, thinking about this site, these were the recommendations for modifying the harvest plans for the site. So retaining trees for use as songproof trees, at least 12 standing trees per hectare, dispersed either individually or in small clumps, and at least 4.5 meters apart and at least 3 meters above the subcanopy, because the birds need to be able to pop up above the subcanopy to look around and sing. Second point, minimize disturbance to ground vegetation, moss-covered, down woody material, stumps, hummocks, and root masses of ferns and trees. To leave the treetops and limbs on site to enhance woody debris and forest floor structure. To avoid the use of pesticides that negatively impact insect prey, and the herbicides that would reduce the shrub component, because that's really crucial for them. And to locate trails a distance from the no harvest buffer equal to the boom length of the harvester. That was something that we learned from the very first harvest that we did, that I showed you on a previous slide. Basically, the harvester went right up to the buffer, the edge of the buffer. So we started incorporating that into the BMP operational guidelines. Okay, so those were the instructions we gave to the forestry company, and this was Port Hawkesbury paper. And this is after the harvest. So this is a post-harvest drone map. I'm sorry, it's a little grainy, but the yellow locations this time are 2023 birds. This was the birds that we found after the harvest. The little blue circles are those 25-meter no harvest buffers, and you can see that fits pretty well into what we're looking at for the harvest. The gray areas have had the trees removed. And the big green circles are those larger BMP buffers. So within the green areas, that list of things that the Canada warbler that needed to be taken into consideration for Canada warbler were incorporated into the harvest plan. And in terms of tree density, their harvest plan had supposedly had already had more than the minimum required tree density, so that they didn't have to modify that part. But if you look at where the yellow diamonds are in relation to the blue circles, it looks like maybe there was a bit of withdrawal of the birds away from the harvest. It's a very tentative conclusion. We'll continue to monitor the site for at least a year or two more. But for the most part, you know, harvesting with BMPs did maintain Canada warblers at the site. This is another site in Cape Breton where we had both Canada warblers and olive-sided flycatchers on the harvest block. Again, this area is the harvest block, and We also had some common nighthawks in the area. So I'm first going to talk about the BMPs for the Canada warbler, and then we'll move on to the olive-sided flycatcher. Oh, sorry. First, I'm going to show you what our instructions based on the birds that we found there that went to PHP then came out as a modified harvest plan. So for the areas that were not included in the BMP buffers, they harvested the site as planned, and this was a 10% retention clumps. So very few trees remained. In the BMP buffers for both of the species, we had 30% retention clumps, and then we had the no harvest buffers as well. And because we had both Canada warbler and olive-sided flycatchers on the block, that ended up perhaps having, we ended up with more no harvest buffers overall. And this is what the site looks like now. It was harvested over last winter and resurveyed over last summer. The yellow diamonds are now the 2023 birds. This is where we found Canada warblers this year after harvest. And the orange circles show the no harvest buffers for Canada warbler, and the blue circles are the BMP buffers. So it certainly harvesting with BMPs at the site certainly maintained Canada warbler use of the site. Oh, and you can also see that I've got the depth of water table mapped on here, where dark pink is the less than 10 centimeter deep water, light pink less than 50 centimeters, and aqua less than a meter. So you can see that the area has a lot of wet area around it, as well as within it, a few areas within it. So now we're going to look at the olive-sided flycatcher. Brief introduction to the species. In Nova Scotia, it breeds primarily in spruce forest, especially black spruce swamps and bogs. It also can be found breeding near clear-cut edges where you have mature red and black spruce. Its habitat has a lot of tall snags and residual live trees if it has been harvested. A relatively open canopy, which you get when an area is very wet, or you can also get that through harvesting. And a lot of their sites had a flowering ericaceous shrub layer. As I mentioned before, it's a sallying aerial insectivore, so it perches on the top of a tree and forages from there. These birds are highly territorial. They have really big territories, at least 10 to 20, if not up to 40 hectares. Probably 10 to 20 is a more typical size. They have very high site fidelity, returning to the same territory each year. And they're pretty noticeable birds. They sing and forage from prominent perches at the tops of conifers or snags. And they nest in clumps of large mature conifers. And these are a couple of nest sites here in Nova Scotia. So they need big trees and clumps of big trees for nesting. Okay, we're back to the River Tillard site in Cape Breton. This time we're focusing on the olive-sided flycatcher. The yellow dots are the Canada warblers. So this time the olive-sided flycatchers are shown in green dots. Their no harvest buffer is a beige circle 25-meter buffer around each of those points, and the larger green circles are the BMP buffers. So within the BMP areas, We recommended using uneven age forest management systems when possible. They said it wasn't possible. Um, we recommended leaving clumps of tall trees, especially mature black spruce, standing in cutover areas, and be, because the birds nest in mature spruce clumps and they hunt from the tops of tall trees. We recommended they leave all snags that are not a safety threat. The birds are often use tall snags as hunting perches and avoiding the use of pesticides, including insecticides and herbicides. Um, Bees are a preferred food. They pollinate deciduous flowering shrubs, ericaceous shrubs that are common in their habitat. And if you, and so you can kill the bees with insecticides, you can kill the shrubs with herbicides. So basically, they're pretty susceptible to pesticides. Okay, so now we're going to look at how that worked out for the olive-sided flycatcher. So this is the site, a drone map of the site after harvesting. The little white circles are the 25-meter no harvest buffers, and you can see that it's a little hard to see, but you can see that those little patches have not been harvested. The the yellow circles are the BMP buffers, where the retention was supposed to be 30% rather than 10% in here. And the green diamonds are where we found the birds this last summer after harvesting. And so it looks like there was certainly enough retention of habitat in this area to maintain the birds using this area. But the bird that was using this patch up here disappeared. It's possible that it shifted over here. So it's possible that there wasn't quite enough forest left in this area to support a territory. But I think we have to monitor it for another year or two to have to be more confident in our conclusions. But it certainly worked for this area. But this area is also adjacent to a very large, very large wetland complex. We noticed that the draft BMPs for olive-sided flycatchers were not very specific in terms of tree retention, and so we have done some field studies to try to sort that out. This At the bottom of this slide, you'll see a map of one of our transects. So we did 10 by 50 meter transects through 20 olive-sided flycatcher territories. We mapped out the trees. This shows the locations of the different trees. We measured every tree, the height, the DBH, health class, and did the same for snags. So we've done some analysis on that, which I'll show you on the next slide. And we also are going to be analyzing larger areas because a 10 by 50 meter plot is a very small part of an olive-sided flycatcher's territory. So we're currently analyzing 5-hectare blocks of drone images of the sites. But what we found in our transects were that snags are a very large fraction of the trees. So dead trees, over 30% dead trees, typically across the different territories. DBH, the trees aren't terribly large, and they're not terribly tall. Primarily spruce and some fir. There are some hardwoods and pine, mostly in southwest Nova Scotia sites. And I had an honors student who analyzed the spacing of the trees and for looking at trees that were greater than 8 meters tall, which basically they need to be perching on trees that are at least that tall. And these tended to be clumped with 2 to 11 trees per clump, and the trees being to 1.5 meters apart. And if you look at the health class of the trees, these are live trees, you can see that, they're not terribly healthy trees, you know, primarily in olive-sided flycatcher habitats. These are trees that are not doing all that well, but they create a relatively open habitat, which is ideal for their foraging. Common nighthawk is an aerial insectivore that actually nests on bare ground, um, and roosts on branches and logs during the daytime. So they're primarily active at foraging at dawn and dusk. They can be found in clear cuts, burns, rock barrens, open fields, open woodlands, gravel pits, and they used to nest a lot on gravel roofs. In the day, they're roosting. The BMPs that I'll show you on the next slide are going to be focusing on creating roosting habitat. They have large home ranges. They have smaller territories, about 250 meters across. The males boom to defend the territories, so you can use that as an indicator that breeding males are in the area. And these are just some of the different areas that you might find common nighthawks. We did pick them up frequently in ARUs, but the site that had the most common nighthawks was a site in Cape Breton called Glencoe Mills. And and if you look at the map, the blue diamonds are the 2022 observations, and the circles are the 2023 observations. And so you can see there's a lot of common nighthawks in this area. It's not clear to me why this area is so good for nighthawks. And we also put out ARUs, and we found that there's one patch of forest here, and outlined in red, where the trees, it's wet forest. The trees are relatively mature, and the ARUs in there keep picking up species at risk: Canada warbler, olive-sided flycatcher, rusty blackbird, but we never actually observed them in the field. But PHB agreed to make that a leave block and not cut those trees. They said if they went in, we first asked them to put in a BMP, but they said if they take any trees out, they're all going to blow over. And so they said, we'll just leave it. But I recommended, because this site is important for common nighthawks, I recommended these things, if possible, to incorporate while harvesting. So retaining large dead or declining trees, so they would be a future source of large woody debris, and at least 12 cavity trees per hectare, half of them with a large DBH. They could skid these back onto the block um, if in order to create this. If the trees are that large, they could put them back onto the block in bits that are at least 2 meters long. They could create suitable nesting conditions by leaving areas of old and deactivated roads and other open areas undisturbed during the breeding season. They can avoid or limit herbicide pesticide use, and in case of there's natural disturbance, recommending leaving at least 1/4 of the area unsalvaged. And now we'll look at the eastern wood pewee. This is a bird that is more common in southwest Nova Scotia than in other parts of Nova Scotia that we've been sampling. It's a salient insectivore like the olive-sided flycatcher, but it's foraging from under the canopy on exposed perches. Like if you look at the photograph on the lower right, you can see pine. You see pines with lots of little side branches. They like to sit on those. They Um, they feed and nest on their territory, which is about 3 hectares in size. They build open cup nests. Um, and in Nova Scotia, we're finding them mostly in mature Acadian upland forest, either hardwood or mixed wood. Mixed wood um, more often. Um, their sites have a multi-layered canopy with lots of small gaps, and some studies have suggested they can be more abundant in uplands where there are rivers, lakes, and wetlands nearby because of the insect prey that they produce. So the Eastern Wood Peewee BMPs were based on BMPs that were developed in Ontario. Um, so that in the BMP buffers, we recommended leaving large mature trees. These were numbers from Ontario: 30 centimeter DBH in deciduous stands, 35 centimeters DBH in conifer or mixedwood stands, maintaining a total basal area of 22 meters per hectare, maintaining small gaps, and we were doing some research on forest retention and gap size recommendations because we weren't sure whether these were going to um, match very well with Nova Scotia. So from our surveys, we found that the birds were the sites that we sampled um, sites in south where birds were breeding in southwestern Nova Scotia. They were primarily multi-age, multi-layered mixedwood forest. It typically had a main canopy height of around 16 to 17 meters, but they tended to have also emergent trees. These were often white pines sticking up above the main canopy, and then also a subcanopy. The crown closure was about 66%. We measured the canopy gap sizes and found that the average canopy gap size in their territories was about 20 square meters. That's not a very big canopy gap. Um, and if we look at over on the right side, we have um, from the BMPs from Ontario, the DBH they recommended. Our average DBH was 28.5 centimeters. They're recommending 35. And the total basal area we found was about 21 meters squared per hectare, whereas they were recommending 22. So that's pretty similar. So I think in general, maybe our trees aren't quite as large as the trees uh, in Ontario. So we're able to apply a BMP for Eastern Wood Peewee at this site, managed by the Medway Community Forest Co-op in Southwest Nova Scotia. We had in 2022 we found 2 areas being used by different pairs of Eastern Wood Peewees. Those are shown in the pink diamonds. And we also had a Canada warbler off to the edge of the harvest block over to the left, the little yellow diamond in a swamp in that area. And so we recommended, similar to the system that we used in Cape Breton, we recommended a 25-meter no harvest buffer and a 100-meter 25 to 100-meter BMP buffer for the species. And this shows the drone canopy height model from before harvesting on the left and after harvesting on the right. And so the pink diamonds on the left picture are the 2022 locations of Eastern Wood Peewees, which you had also seen on the previous map. There's also a chimney swift observation in here, and the Canada warbler over here. the after harvesting, and they used a gap harvest um, prescription. So all the little black circles that you're seeing here over on the right, those are um, those are now canopy gaps created through the removal of trees. And you can see that we actually found more peewee activity and more widespread peewee activity after harvest. So it's possible that the harvesting made a more attractive habitat, or it could just be annual variation. But we did document that there were indeed three different singing males in 2023, whereas there were only two found in 2022. Um, and we also had additional chimney swift sightings that year. So this harvest seemed to be suitable for maintaining eastern wood pewee habitat. One thing I did notice, we took a field trip in here with the DNRR in at the end of the summer, and I noticed that in these gaps, the harvesters had knocked down most of the side branches of the trees, which are the places where the peewees need to perch. So I recommended that, if possible, to try to rescue those branches in future harvests. The chimney swift was not one of the 5 species that we developed um, the 2-page fact sheet BMP for, because we hadn't anticipated being able to do anything about chimney swift, since people hadn't found a nest of a bird in the forest, a natural nest for some time. So chimney swifts are small birds with small um, dark gray black birds with rapid flight, rapid wing beats, stiff pointy wings. They originally roosted in large hollow trees, but pairs likely nested in smaller trees. But today, most birds are thought to nest in chimneys or other human-made structures like barns. However, we found chimney swift using a live pine tree and at one of the harvest blocks in the Medway Community Forest Co-op management area. The tree was a live white pine. You can see over on the left, that's my assistant, who is over 6 feet tall. So it's a large tree. It's 23 meters high, 84 centimeters in diameter. And birds were seen coming in and coming out of this woodpecker hole, which you can see on the upper right. This was 6.6 meters above the ground, it faced north, and that didn't appear to be a pileated woodpecker cavity, but probably a northern flicker. The site was conifer-dominated forest, primarily white pine, red spruce, and eastern hemlock. It had been harvested, partially harvested 13 years ago, in a little by using a gap harvest method connected by trails. And this is one of the trails that you can see in the picture on the left. And this particular section was the section with the largest and the oldest trees. So we're hoping that this area is going to be protected. We're going to be doing more research, more surveys there next summer to see if there are other birds, uh, additional trees being used, because we frequently saw several, as many as a dozen chimney swifts flying around this area. And I wanted to mention that ARUs actually helped us locate the nest tree. Um, we we started uh, monitoring a couple of known nests and structures. This is one at the upper right, and what we're looking at here are calls detected by the ARU. These are audio moths from 4 a.m. until 9:30 p.m. And you can see that um, there is activity through the day starting around 6 a.m., but a very, very large peak before the birds go into roost at night. Um, the same, um, so here morning period is this morning period shown in the lower two graphs are from ARUs in that forest block where we found the nest. So the morning extends from 4 a.m. to 8:40, and the evening from 8 to 9:30, basically. So those are the two periods that are um, the same. Looking at the two graphs, or not, they don't have the same x-axis, obviously. So what you can see is that there are similarities in the vocal activity that we're picking up in the ARUs in the forest with the ARUs at the nest site. You have activity, sort of low rate of activity through the day, starting at 6 a.m., and then a peak at at uh, at at dusk as the birds are going in. And Abby Lewis at MTRI documented that birds were going into that tree over a period of a month from July 25th to August 25th. So as we did not develop our BMPs for the chimney swift. I found this one online for Southwest Ontario, produced by Birds Canada. So they mentioned that natural habitat is forests with large old trees, as big as 125 centimeter DBH, that develop heart rot, which results in hollow cavities. And you would need a really big tree like that to have a roost for a large flock. They usually nest in or roost in dead cavity trees with decayed or broken tops. They also use live trees. White pine is frequently used, and higher densities have been found in unlogged forest in comparison with logged forest. So their BMPs listed maintaining tall, large diameter trees to allow old large trees to reach the age and size needed for heart rot, and retaining hollow, sick, or decaying trees with a high DBH. And that if these pose a safety hazard for blowdown, then don't harvest within a radius equal to the height of the tree around them. We're hoping to find more chimney swift, uh, more chimney swifts using natural tree nests and roosts in the coming summer. So rusty blackbird habitat is basically conifer dominated and mixed forest in low slope landscapes with multiple wetlands and streams. They are particularly common around beaver ponds and in areas where there are stream and lake edges, bogs, and fens. They have very high site fidelity, but a very large home range. They feed on aquatic invertebrates that they pick out of shallow water or mud or under leaf litter. And they're one of the earlier nesting birds, and they prefer to nest near or over shallow water. And over on the right side, I show three nesting sites for rusty blackbirds in Nova Scotia. So we had developed draft BMPs for the species, but we didn't actually get to apply any specifically for this species in our project so far because we just didn't find any using a site frequently enough to design a BMP. However, we did pick them up in ARUs at some of our sites. So the BMPs are to leave a treed buffer around all wetlands and streams. there already is a requirement in Nova Scotia to leave a 20-meter buffer around streams, and I think this species has benefited greatly from that. Um, they BMPs include retaining mature live trees and snags, dispersed and in clumps for perch trees. So, like the Canada warbler, the male has to get up into a high place to look around for predators and watch its mate. Um, to avoid harvesting nesting sites, because if a bird has used a site, it's likely to come back and use that site again. Um, and retaining 50% of the overstory in mature shade intolerant softwood stands. And if there isn't enough advanced natural regeneration, planting native softwood species at this particular density is a recommendation. So as I mentioned, rusty blackbird probably has benefited from the BMPs that we've done for all of Cytophlycatria and Canada warbler so far. Maybe eventually we'll find a site where we can set out a BMP specifically for that species. But you know, there are a number of BMPs that are in common for the forested wetland SAR. First of all, avoid silvicultural practices during the breeding season. Avoid pesticides that are going to impact non-pest insect populations, and also shrubs that the insect prey need, and shrubs that create habitat for the species. To avoid activities that may alter wetland hydrology, such as road harvesting and road building. And if harvesting has to happen, it should be done on frozen ground. But really, leaving a buffer around wetlands, open wet areas, and streams would be highly beneficial for all of these species. It's something you can do without having to worry about doing a survey to find out if a bird is actually there. Okay, so in closing, these are my thoughts on how you might go about incorporating BMPs into private woodlot management. Um, First, it would be a good idea to learn to identify the preferred habitat of each of the SAR species. And right now I'm working on a project with Ducks Unlimited to put together a habitat guide for the forested wetland SAR. But this could be done for any of the species. You could apply BMPs for the SAR that are most likely to be present based on your knowledge of your woodlot. You could use SAR records and habitat models to identify areas more likely to have suitable habitat. So perhaps this is something your woodlot associations can help you do. You could apply a 25 to 50-meter buffer around all wetlands, wet forests, streams, and vernal pools. That will benefit SAR birds and other birds. And you can use uneven age management techniques to increase the diversity in the vertical and the horizontal structure within stands. Another thing you can do is thinking about prioritizing and scheduling silvicultural work. Um, I get a lot of um, harvesters saying, well, what if I can't stop harvesting for 2 to 3 months during the nesting season? Well, I think you can still do things that will, choose to do the least harm. You can prioritize sites or stands or areas for work outside of the nesting season if those sites have SAR or SAR habitat, if those sites support mature forest birds which are declining, and if they are sites with wet forest or adjacent to wetlands. There have been a lot of studies now documenting that forested and open wetlands are more productive sites, they have more bird species, and they have more individuals and more SAR than upland sites do. And that is the end of my presentation. Let me get that slide back up. Sorry about that. I just wanted to acknowledge my field assistants who um, worked long, hard hours trying to track down these birds. Um, Partners, Clean Annapolis River Project, Mersey Tobiatic Research Institute, Medway Community Forest Co-op, Port Hawkesbury Paper, West 4, the Biodiversity Office of Natural Resources and Renewables, and the Guestwick Conservation Collaborative. And for funding, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have federal funding through the Habitat Stewardship Program and the Southwest Nova Scotia Priority Place, provincial funding through Nova Scotia Department of Resources and Renewables, industry